Welcome to lesson 6, NoSQL data model. Yep. We're gonna do more deep dive on MongoDB and Mongoose, right? So we'll be connecting, right? We'll be modeling. We define a schema and using the Mongodb Shell as well, and making your database up and running, right? So recap with the MVC pattern. Your model holds the persistent data, right? And the data flows go from the model to the controller, where the controller can process and make some changes to the data and show that to the view, right? For storing data, we need a database. Without database, any changes that we've done to when you hit save, it would not persist, right? Being able to do the CRUD from a database allows us to have dynamic data, right? Instead of static data, right? Fixed data is static data. Yep. Okay, so MongoDB features, we have the following, like document oriented, doing replication, indexing for fast searching, ad hoc queries, high performance, aggregations, and so on and so forth, right? If you go back to, if you have like relational database experience, the left hand side is a MySQL relational database where the SQL syntax is there, the MySQL syntax, and they map it to specific functions that you can use the same thing with NoSQL, right? Okay. Connecting the Express app to MongoDB using Mongoose, right? We need these object document mapper, right? So that when we query, right, we can now wrap it in an object, and now using the object methods, we can easily manipulate or use that data we got from the database, right? So it does provide abstraction layer on top of MongoDB, right? Because it wraps it, right? Establish default values for document properties and validating data. Queries using function chaining makes code flexible and readable, right? So here's another example where you use the native MongoDB on the left hand side to establish connection, right? Build a query, you iterate over the results, and you terminate the connection. And as you can see on the right hand side, it is more readable and verbose, right? Which is using the Mongoose, right? So, if so API and database, in the middle would be Mongoose, right? Just so you know, the Mongoose is something that you would still add in your API server, right? Okay, so a more zoom in view is in your application server, right? You want to have your Node.js and Express, and also your Mongoose, right? So MongoDB provides a connection, Mongoose provides a connection with MongoDB and Express Node.js. Okay, because it's another module, right? So you have to include that in your package.json in your dependencies, right? And then so that when other people get your code and npm install, it will also install Mongoose right away, right? To start off with, as usual, we have to require it first, right? And then assign it to a variable. So we got that Mongoose object, and now we can access methods such as the connect, wherein you need to supply the parameter with the db URI, right? It's like the URL, right? It could be your MongoDB Atlas URI. And the second parameter to use the new URL parser equals to true. It just means that don't use the old URL parser, right? Just leave this as default. Okay, so why model the data? So that your data has structure, right? Makes the data have consistent naming structure in each location, easy to retrieve, easy to manipulate, right? So easy to find. Okay, so the data here, moving the data to the model, right? The data is currently in the controller, right? And then we now want to move the data backward to the model, allowing the controller to be dynamic, right? So if the last lesson we still have like the maybe hard-coded this values description in the controller, we now move that to the model, but instead of the hard-coded text, we now have queries that would interact with the database, right? Model would be the last one, then it would query the database. Okay. Then just so we have the same design thinking for MongoDB, right? We define the following. Collection has many documents. Documents includes key value pairings. And we can also have a schema. Each schema is made up of a number of paths, right? And each path can have multiple properties, right? Okay. Okay. So the basic structure is you have the path name and then you have the properties object. You can define as many as you want. String is any string, UTF and 8 encoded. Number, any number with some restrictions. Date, so it uses the ISO date object. So you use the ISO date and then open parentheses and insert the date so that it can convert it properly. Boolean, true or false. Buffer for images. Mix, any data type. Array, object ID. This is the unique ID that is created every time you create the document. You don't really need to add a value here. By default, it creates its own. Okay, defining a simple Mongoose schema. So Mongoose schema is a JavaScript object. Hooray, hooray. Makes our lives easier. We define the schema in the model folder as well. And you need the Mongoose to define a Mongoose schema, right? So let's say you have this in the view, right? In the JSON object or in the back end, you would have these values, right? Name starcups, address is this address, right? So that is how we would define a schema, right? So the schema for the location would have these properties, right? So name is a string, address is another string, rating is a number, and so on, right? And then we want to create that structure, right? So we do have like the schema adds the validation rules, right? Okay. And the last part there is an array of strings. So we start off with, we want to have a new mongoose.schema, right? We want to have that new schema object and then assign it to the location schema. Okay. Also, we can assign default values, right? By adding the default keyword and adding validation such as required true. It means that let's say there should always be a value here, right? Geographic data, you can use the GeoJSON. Yep. You use the chords path. Min max, yes. So you extended your Mongoose schema to add the validation like required and added the coordinates as well, right? And the last part, sorry, you did add also an index with the coordinates. So you added the indexing. Okay. So creating more complex schema with subdocuments. So relational database, you use the join keyword or in your SQL statements. In your document DB NoSQL type database, you can just reference to the ID, right? To the user ID table. Oh, user ID document, right? Compiling Mongo schema to models. So the application has the schema and the schema compiles to the model, right? The model creates a single instance or an array of instances, right? It then now can map to a single document to a database or an array of instances in the database, right? Okay, so let's go first to our MongoDB shell. Make sure you install MongoDB in your local machine, right, in your computer. And if you're using Windows, make sure to put the bin folder in the environment variables and just restart your shell and then hit Mongo and you should have a greater than symbol, right? And you can now use the show DBs to see if you get an output, and you can use the local DB, one of your default database. You can show the list of collections inside of the database, right? And then collections for relational database, these are your tables, right? And then you can query like a find everything, right? With the db dot the collections name. So this can change db dot location, right? Dot find. And you would get a series of text that's hard to read. So you may want to add the dot pretty here to prettify and make it easier for humans to read, right? So the two steps we want to query, then do instructions, right? So the first is you want to have the db.locations, then dot update, right? It means that we do want to do an update operation for our database, and we do want to look for the name starcup. So we would look in the documents. So we would look in the collection, the locations collection, and we'll look for the uh, document that has a the property name and has a value starcups. Once we find that, we want to do a push, right? So push means that we just want to add to the array. Then we want to add to push in the reviews array, and inside the reviews array we want to push this object, right? That includes author, ID, rating, new date, and so on and so forth. Okay. Okay, so and when I say object, it's called subdocument, so another document as well. Uh, it might be used interchangeably because again, it's using the JSON notation, right? Getting your database live, you can use the mlab. Now, it could be now it's discontinued, so you might want to go to using Heroku. I know, sorry, to MongoDB Atlas. They have a free here, and it should be easy to do so to get the connection string and Google stuff. If you got stuck, let me know. You can ask me. Okay, so this might not work now, the mlab. And then adding mlab, these are the steps. If you still get it to work, but if not, it's fine. And the URI components, right? This is the connection string. A connection string is just a term being used when you need to connect to a database and you need to supply a string value so that you can connect to it, right? So it would include the protocol, the credentials, server's address, port, and database name. Making the right application to use, usually you would have these where if you have if you're developing locally, right, meaning adding features and not yet pushing it live, meaning to the customer for the customers to use, you usually would want to do it locally in your machine, meaning you have a development database in your machine as well, or it could be hosted in your company only, right? So but if you want to push it to live, you do want to put it in a platform like Heroku, and the Heroku could maybe interact with the live database, right? So setting up the environment variables. So again, if our application server has environment variables, our Heroku platform also can store environment variables. You can do so with the command line interface using these keywords. Another alternative for this one, if you go to your Heroku dashboard and go to that specific project that you've associated it with, and you would see environment variables as well. So you can set it there manually with the graphical user interface or using your shell with the command line interface. Okay. Connection portion, private repositories. So, okay. So the if statements would denote that if the node env is production, meaning it senses that it's for production, right? Then it will use this Heroku URL, right? Heroku MongoDB URL. In this case, if you use MongoDB Atlas, that's going to be a MongoDB Atlas URI, right? Or if it's local, you would see localhost MongoDB right? Okay, so if it's okay, so the DB URI is just a variable, so you can just add that there. Okay, and then you want to connect to it, right? You want to establish a connection. See, console.log, testing before launching, if you do have a connection, right? And then once you're done, you could do the steps again to add all the files to staging and commit, so that you have save a local version, local copy version, right? And once your local machine is updated with version control, you now want to update your Heroku, right? And you push all the code there. You can check the Heroku logs as well. So that is a summary. So for Mongoose, remember that in your Express application, you need to define a schema and then a model, right? So you can execute queries as well. Okay. See you next lesson.